And now you can see we have a ball that bounces and slowly stops and just rests on the floor. And that's sort of what a normal ball would do. And again, it's pretty easy. You can just play around with these, move them around, and get a feel for keyframes and how they change the look, feel, and personality of your animation as it plays through the timeline. So when you first open a new instance of Blender, this is what you should see. I'm just going to go over some quick navigation here to get you up to speed. If you scroll with your mouse wheel, it will scroll in and out, zoom in and out of the view. You can also click down and hold on the middle mouse button and move your mouse to rotate the view. And then if I press and hold Shift while I hold my middle mouse down and drag, it will move the view. And you can see that all of these options are up here in these widgets. This one is rotate, this one is zoom, and this one is to move the view up and down and side to side. And if you need to know the keys I'm pressing, you can look down here in the corner where you can see my mouse clicks and the keystrokes that I press on the keyboard. Okay, so having that out of the way, let's press A to select everything in our scene and X and then choose delete. Because we want to add our own objects. So come up here to add, mesh, and then select plane. Now we have a little plane here that we'll use as our floor. With the plane selected, we can press S to scale that and just drag your mouse and it will scale that up. And then when you get to the size you want, you can just left click to set that in. Okay, so now let's add our ball. And if you hover over this add button, you can see that the shortcut key is Shift A. So I'm going to do that instead. So Shift A, and it brings up our add menu. And then I'm going to choose Mesh UV Sphere. And let's scroll in here and you can see that our ball looks more like a disco ball, which is not really good for bouncing. It doesn't really matter, it just looks weird. But we can smooth this out by right-clicking and selecting Shade Smooth. And now we have something that is a little bit more smooth, looks like a ball that would bounce. So now we have the ball and the floor, and you can see that if I click on either of them, the one that's selected has this orange outline. So make sure that the ball is selected. And then I'm going to scroll out here and then open up the Properties panel by pressing N on the keyboard, N like Nancy. And then we're going to focus on this location here. So let's come over to the opposite side, click this button, which is the Move tool. And now we have these arrows. So I'm going to click the blue arrow and pull this up. And you can see that the Z-axis over here starts to change in value, and it goes up as we move the ball up. And if I move it up and down, you can see that value is changing because this is the Z-axis of our location. And just so that we can see things better, I'm going to go ahead and turn off the overlays with this button right here. So as I move this up and down, I'm going to move this to around 7. And now it's at 7.0845. Let's make this a little bit cleaner. We can just click in here and then just type 7 and enter. And that's just a little bit cleaner and easier for us to work with. If you accidentally select the floor, no worries, just click on the ball and it will be selected again. Okay, so let's animate this thing. Come down here and we're going to pull up our timeline. Hover your mouse over this divider line here until you see the double arrows and then click and drag and we can pull that up. Now we can see our full frame range here. And you can see here, this is the start and end frames that we have. So the start is on frame 1 and the end is on frame 250. And our playhead is on frame 1. That's this blue line here with the number 1 on top. So just make sure that we're on frame 1. If you're not on frame 1 for some reason, just click this button here and it will jump back to frame 1. Okay, so let's adjust our view here just a little bit. And then hover your mouse over the preview, press I on the keyboard to insert a keyframe, and we have the insert keyframe menu with all of these options. I'm going to choose location, and now we can see the fields for the location have turned yellow. And you can see both of these here have turned yellow because they are the same thing. And if we look in our timeline, you can see that we have our keyframe. And if I click and drag anywhere in this top bar with these frame numbers, I can drag that playhead. And you can now see the keyframe is this little yellow diamond-shaped thing. And in that keyframe, it holds the location of all 3 axes, the X, Y, and Z, in our 3D space. And now you might notice that the location fields have turned green. And this is because we've moved the playhead and there are no keyframes on the current frame that the playhead is on. So let's go ahead and make another keyframe. I'm going to make it on frame 20. So I'm going to type in here. This is the current frame. If you hover over this, it says current frame, which is 35. I can click in here and then just type 20 and enter, and it moves the playhead to frame 20. But before we make another keyframe, we need to move our ball. So let's bring that down to where it's touching the floor, and we can adjust it however we want. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just something to where it looks like it's resting on the floor. And now you can see that the Z-axis has changed to orange. And this is because we've changed the location from the original location of the last keyframe. And we still have not yet set a keyframe. And this is important because if we decide to move our playhead before we make a keyframe, then our ball is just going to snap to its original position of the last keyframe that we made, which is 7 on the Z-axis. So let's do that again. I'm going to put this back to frame 20, which is still currently at 7, so let's bring that down to where it's touching the floor. Again, this is entirely up to you. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just make it look like it's resting on the floor. And now, before we move our playhead anywhere, let's hover our mouse over the preview, press I, and then choose location again. And now we've set a keyframe, everything turns yellow, and then we have a keyframe down here in our timeline. And now if I take the playhead and I click and drag and I scrub between the two, you can see the animation. So congratulations, you have now just made your first 3D keyframe animation in Blender.
Yay!
Of course, this isn't a ball bounce, this is just a ball move, so we've got to continue it here. But I'm going to adjust the timeline first, because we won't need 250 frames for this. So I'm going to just go to the end frame over here, click in the field, and then type 50. And now you can see the frame range has changed from 1 to 50. That's this lighter area right here. And then I'm going to zoom in by pressing and holding Shift and then click B, and that brings our box zoom select. And then I can just click and drag an area that I want to zoom in, and boom. Now we have our 1 to 50 frame range filling up our entire timeline. We can also zoom in by scrolling in and out. And then I can also adjust this by middle clicking and dragging left to right and up and down. But be careful, if for some reason you lose your keyframes, you probably just need to adjust your timeline. So middle click and then drag down all the way until you see those keyframes. So let's see what this looks like in real time. We can come over to this button, press play. And now you can see our ball move. And it just loops through the frame range that we have from 1 to 50. And it will keep doing that until we press pause, which we can do by pressing the spacebar. Spacebar will actually play and pause. So we need to add another keyframe to make this ball go back up. So right now we have the ball falling down to the floor from frame 1 to frame 20. So I'm just going to go another 20 frames to frame 40 to make that even there. So now I could do this the long way, and that would be I would move the ball or come over here and just type in 7 again. Hover my mouse over the preview, press I, choose location, and now we have our keyframe. And that's the way we created the first one. And now if we play, we can see we have our ball motion that moves down and then back up, and this can work just fine. But that takes a little bit too long to make that keyframe, especially when we already have a keyframe with that value. So let's go ahead and be lazy. The first thing I'm going to do is delete the keyframe that we just made, and we can do this by left clicking on it, make sure that that is the only one is selected, and we know this because that's the only one that's yellow. If we look at the other two, they are now white, which means that they are unselected. So with this one selected, make sure you hover your mouse over the timeline and then press X, and then choose delete keyframes. Okay, quick side note, be very careful when you're pressing buttons in Blender. In Blender, your mouse is context sensitive. That means if you're pressing buttons for the 3D preview, make sure you hover your mouse over the 3D preview. And same thing if it's for the timeline, over the timeline. Because if you hover your mouse over here and then press X to delete, then you're going to delete your ball or whatever you have selected. If that happens, don't worry, just Control Z to undo that. And then you can come back down here, hover your mouse over the timeline, X, and then delete your keyframes. And this is going to be with any buttons you press, so be mindful of where your mouse cursor is at all times. Our ball now snaps back to the floor because the last keyframe we have is of it on the floor. And now we have our original falling motion here. So like I said, let's be lazy. We already have a keyframe with the value of 7, which is the first one. So I'm going to select the first one and then press Shift D to duplicate it. And as you move your mouse, you can now see we are dragging out a duplicated keyframe. I'm going to drag this to frame 15 and press the left mouse button to set that there. And now you can see this orange solid line that goes in between the two duplicated keyframes. And this just means that the value does not change between these two frames. You can see that it constantly stays at 7. And you can see this represented in our 3D space because the ball stays in place until frame 15, and then on frame 16 it starts to move down, and then at frame 20 it is on the floor. So let's select this one, make sure that's the only one that's selected, and then click and drag. We're going to move this one past this other keyframe, and now you can see the line goes away. And that is because now it is not a constant value. So the line breaks because we are now going from frame 1, where the ball is at 7, to frame 20, where the ball is on the floor. And then from 20 to this keyframe, which is all the way back up at 7 again. If I click and drag that keyframe back over here and then left click to set it, the solid line comes back. And a way to remember this is that you have this solid line and it holds the line when the value doesn't change. So the value stays holding the line at 7 between these two keyframes. If there is no line, then it doesn't hold the line. Okay, so let's drag this over to frame 40, and now we have the same thing that we had, but we just did it a little bit faster with the duplicating of the keyframe. And now you can see we have the motion of the ball in a fashion that looks somewhat similar to a ball bouncing. It starts up in the air, comes down, touches the ground, and then goes back up. Congratulations, you have just made your first 3D ball bounce animation with keyframes in Blender.
Yay!
And the power of keyframe animation is that you can quickly change the look and the feel and the personality of this ball bounce by just changing one of these keyframes. So let's just keep the timeline playing, and then I'm going to click just the middle one here and drag it all the way to frame 5. And now you can see that we've completely changed the feel of this ball bounce. But let's close our property panel by pressing N again on the keyboard, just so we have a little bit more room. And now you can see that the ball is not so much bouncing, but it's giving this hammer motion, like it's a machine or something, and it's hammering down on the floor. Boom! Boom! And then it slowly goes back up and boom! Back down again. And all we had to do is just change the position of the middle keyframe. And so let's pause this and see what's going on here. So if we bring our playhead back to the beginning, you can see from the value of 7 up in the air all the way to the floor, there are only 5 keyframes. So the ball only has to travel 5 keyframes from the air to the ground. So you can see this if you start at frame 1 and then press your right arrow on the keyboard, and you can go frame by frame, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and now it's already down on the floor. But from the floor back up to the air, we have 35 keyframes that it has to go through. So if we arrow through, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I mean, it just takes a long time. So we just click and drag and move that up all the way to the value of 7. And that's what gives us this illusion of a hammer. So it goes really quick down and then slow back up. But we can achieve the opposite result if we click and drag this middle one again all the way to frame 35. And now you can see we've completely changed the feel and the look of our animation. Now, in order to get from the air to the ground, it takes 35 frames, and then back up into the air, it only takes 5 frames, which it gives us this sort of recoil look. So it comes down really slowly, touches the ground, and snaps back up really quickly as if it doesn't like touching that ground. So you can see how powerful 3D animation is with keyframes. By just changing 1 or 2 keyframes, you can change the entire look, feel, and personality of your animation. So now let's select our middle keyframe, make sure that's the only one selected, and then press and hold Shift and select this keyframe. Now with both of these selected, we can grab them by pressing G on the keyboard to grab, and then move our mouse all the way over here. Let's drop them at 5 and 10, and then left click to set those there. Now we have a really quick ball bounce. It takes 5 frames to go down, touch the floor, and 5 frames back up. And then it just hangs in the air on these last frames all the way till 50, and then it repeats. Okay, so now it's your turn. The challenge now for you is to take everything that you've just learned in this lesson and make the ball bounce 3 times instead of just once. I don't care how you do it, as long as you use any of the methods here in this lesson. You can make all of your keyframes the long way. You can duplicate the keyframes. You can move them. I don't care how long the animation is. I don't care how short it is. I don't care how high the ball bounces. I just want you to have fun with it, be creative, and make the ball bounce 3 times. So go ahead and pause the video now. Do your animation, and then come back and unpause the video, and I will show you a couple of ways of how I might do this if I'm trying to be creative. So get ready and go ahead and pause the video now. Okay, welcome back. Have you completed your animation with the 3 ball bounces? If you haven't, go ahead and finish that and come back, but I'm going to show you how I might do a 3 ball bounce here. So the easiest way is to be lazy, like I like to do, and just take these last 2 keyframes and duplicate them and put them on 15 and 20, and now we have 2 ball bounces. And then duplicate them again and put them on 25 and 30, and now we have 3 ball bounces. So that's the easiest way to make 3 ball bounces there, but that's not very exciting or creative or whatever. So let's do it a little differently. I'm going to go ahead and delete these, and what I can do is actually select these ones here by shift clicking, and that's a little bit long, especially if you have a lot of keyframes. Another way you can do this is clicking and dragging. I can click and drag, or I can press B to box select, and then click and drag over all of these keyframes at the same time. Then hover my mouse over the timeline, press X, and then select delete keyframes. So now I have my 1 ball bounce here. I'm going to delete this one on frame 10 as well, because I don't want it to go up to value 7. In the real world, when a ball bounces, it doesn't go as high as it started. So I'm going to bring this up to maybe, let's say, 5. Okay, so on frame 10, I'm going to press I to insert a location keyframe. And now we have a ball that bounces, but doesn't go back up quite as high as it started. But it always does go down to the same position on the floor. So I'm going to take this keyframe here, where it's touching the floor, and I'm going to duplicate that, Shift D, put that at frame 15. And then on frame 20, it's going to bounce back up, but not quite as high as it did before. So let's go to maybe half. So let's 2.5. And then add our location keyframe. And now we have it starting at 7, bouncing on the floor, going up to 5, bouncing again, going up to 2.5. Same thing here. Let's duplicate the keyframe of the position on the floor, move that to frame 25. And then on frame 30, we're just going to go up just 1. Set our keyframe. And then let's duplicate this one on the floor again so that at the end it rests on the floor. And now you can see we have a ball that bounces and slowly stops and just rests on the floor. And that's sort of what a normal ball would do. And again, it's pretty easy. You can just play around with these, move them around, and get a feel for keyframes and how they change the look, feel, and personality of your animation as it plays through the timeline. So I hope this was helpful. I hope you have a good basic grasp of how to make keyframes on a timeline in 3D animation to move an object from one place to another to create different effects. In the next video, we'll continue to modify our animation, but using animation curves instead. So when you are ready, head on over to the next lesson.